Let me now switch to iPad. All right. So this is some object structure that should be very familiar to you from the previous tracing. So I'll try to save our time. So let me just tell you the initial setup over here. So you can see this is a test case that we spoke about, test number 2. Eventually, we're going to call getPaymentDue. But before that, we need to set up the object structure. So you can see this part over here, this part about calling the add facility method from the member class. That's something we did already in detail from the previous tutorial. So that's something I assume you already knew. Okay, but let me just highlight the important points about the pink area I just highlighted over here. Right. So basically, after all the add facility over here, right, you can see after calling the add facility for 3 times over here, the result will be we actually got the NOF over here for Hyung will just be 3. So this value here will be 3, and also we should really correctly set up the indices 0, 1, and 2 to really point to the corresponding objects, right? That's something we spoke about. Let me just do that. So the first add facility is going to make sure index 0 is actually going to point to wherever F1 is pointing to. And the second add facility over here is going to make sure index 1 stores the address that is also stored in F2. And also the third call is going to make sure index 2 is going to point to wherever F3 is actually pointing to. Right? So these are the 3 arrows that we spoke about in detail from the previous video. And notice one thing that's also equally important after all these over here. So you can see still, let me just write now directly just inside the slot. So anything, let me just write it down here. You can see NOF currently is actually 3 over here. So you can think about conceptually, NOF is really pointing to this particular index over here, meaning that if you got the 4th facility object to be added, it should be added in this particular slot. That'll be the first available slot in the array, right? Remember the two purposes we spoke about for the NOF, right? So all the starting from NOF until the end of the array. So every slot now simply just store the value null. Okay, I'll just say null over here. Just null address. It doesn't store anything that's meaningful, simply just null. Okay. So this is why you actually got null pointer exception if you simply say I want to go to index 3 and then call a method getPaymentDue, for example, on this particular slot. It will just be null pointer exception. I'll get to that point in just a moment. One more time. Okay. So now let's talk about how we can trace this particular method call. Okay. So with the object structure like this, right? Let's now talk about this line. Okay, let's say Hyung. Let me use orange over here. So I'm going to do Hyung.getPaymentDue over here, right? So now the context object is actually Hyung, right? That's a context object. Just remember, context objects. So we're calling the getPaymentDue method over here, and every occurrence of this is going to be replaced by the context object Hyung, right? So you can see this part over here and this part over here. They are both going to be replaced by Hyung, which is this particular object here that we are talking about, right? All right, and let's now try to execute this method line by line. Okay, the first line we're actually going to simply set the double to be 0.0. Okay, the double result over here. Let me just put the result over here, and that is going to be 0.0 to begin with. And we're going to run the iteration over here. And how many iterations do we need to run? Let's see this. I is going to be initialized to be 0, and I is going to be strictly less than Hyung.NOF. Hyung.NOF is currently 3. So that means we're going to go for 0, 1, and 2. So there are 3 iterations in total. So that's something you should really keep in mind. So that means we're going to execute this particular body of the loop for 3 times. And then the only thing that will vary, the only thing that will change will be the value for I, which will be 0, 1, and 2. Right? So we got 3 iterations in total. Okay, let's now outline these 3 iterations very carefully. So now for the first iteration, we're going to execute this body of the loop for the first time. And now I will be simply 0. So I would be 0 for the first iteration, and then this has been replaced by Hyung, and I will be replaced by 0, and then call getPaymentDue. And then getPaymentDue over here, let me remind you very quickly that let me just write it down, and then I'll remind you then. So this will be simply by calling this dot facilities at position 0, right? Position 0 over here. Dot get payment due. Yeah, I'll just write it in the short form. Okay. However, let's now try to analyze this expression here very carefully. Okay, and then we'll do the same reasoning for all the others. You should really know about the types for each for this particular dot notation. Think about every dot that we have over here simply means we're going to look up the address in the particular variable or slot of the array, and then go to that particular object, right? That's the dereferencing operator we spoke about. Let's talk about here. If we say this dot facilities over here, this part over here is actually going to, let me just use the pink. So this dot facility, so this should be just Hyung, right? Let me write it down carefully, properly. So this part over here will just be Hyung. And then dot. Right? So how do we interpret this particular part? So this will be Hyung dot facilities. So Hyung dot facilities, which actually stores the address of this particular array. So that's really the first part over here. And then you may go to index 0, index 1, index 2, and etc. Okay, so let me highlight it. So this part here will be Hyung over here dot facilities, which refer to the beginning of this particular array. So that's the first part. Okay, what about the second part? Let me use orange over here. So the second part is going to be this particular expression, and then at index 0. So here, so that's the only part we're adding, right? So this will be Hyung dot facilities, which is already referring to this particular array, and then we go for index 0. And if we go for index 0, that really refer to this slot over here, which store the address. Actually, that will go to this particular objects, right? Okay, let's now highlight it. So that means it's going to be index 0, and then refer to this particular object over here. Okay, that's really this objects. And then when you say dot get payment due. So here, when you say get payment due, so this is really calling on calling the get payment due method on this particular object. So that's a context object, right? So overall, you should really think about the orange one over here is really the context objects for this particular method, right? And what's really the type for this context objects? The context object is really referring to facility, right? So you can, if you follow along the path, it's going to be an index 0 is really referring to the facility objects over here. All right, and now how do we execute this get payment due? Let me remind you very quickly. If you go back to the facility class, which we just added, this particular accessor method get payment due, which is going to calculate price multiplied by units. That's what you will do. All right, and if we do it, if we do the multiplication over here, so 2.5 multiplied by 1, we're going to get 2.5, right? So it's going to be 2.5 for this particular iteration, and then you're going to plus equal the result. So that means it's going to be 2.5 after the first iteration. I hope you're okay with the first iteration, because we're going to repeat the same iteration for another 2 times. Okay, let's do it quickly. And let's say we're going to go for the second iteration, and then we're going to execute this particular line. But now the only thing that will vary is this this I here, right? Just 1. So when I is equal to 1, we're going to say Hyung, very similar pattern as before, so I don't need to repeat. And dot facilities at position 1 dot get payment due. Okay, let's try this. Hyung dot is really referring to this object here, and then go to facilities, which is referring to this particular array, and then go to index 1 over here, and then dot over here is going to make sure you go to the object that's being whose address is being stored in this slot, which is referring to this particular facility objects, right? Hopefully you can see that. So the only thing I will highlight for you is when we refer to index 1 over here, it's really referring to this particular object over here. And then, so what will we get? Well, when you say get payment due, it's going to multiply the unit price by the price, the unit price by the units. So give me 2.0 multiplied by 2. We're going to get 4.0. Agree? So that means we're going to plus equal again. So 4.0 is going to be 6.5. All right, so far so good. Let's now do the third iteration quickly, and then we are basically done. And then I want to mention one more thing about null pointer exception. All right, so now for the third iteration, we're going to execute this line of code for the third time, but now I will be actually 2. So now when I is equal to 2, we're going to get Hyung over here dot facilities at position 1 dot get payment due over here. So let's do it again. Hyung dot, so it's now referring to this particular object. Go to facilities, and then it's going to refer to the beginning of this particular array. Go to index 1. Oh, sorry, go to index 2. Beg your pardon. I should have said index 2. Okay, so now I'm going to say index 2. Right, because you can see index 2 over here. Just make a mistake. Index 2. Let's try it again. Hyung dot is referring to this object over here, and then facilities is referring to this array, the starting of this array, and go to index 2. Index 2 over here is referring to this particular facility object, and then we're going to call get payment due on that particular object. We're going to use 1.5 multiplied by 3. Okay, so the only thing I will highlight is we're talking about index 2, which is referring to this particular objects, right? So we're gonna get 1.5 multiplied by 3, so which will be 4.5. So now 6.5 added 4.5, you're gonna get 11.0, right? That's really this third plus equal we are executing. Hey, right? That's exactly the value we got actually from the JUnit test, which we just did earlier in this video. All right, so that's really about how you can calculate this particular method call, right, with involving 3 iterations. So now it doesn't really matter how many iterations it might be involved. It will be just the same for every iteration. So hopefully the visualization really help over here. Right, let me talk about one final thing before I finish the tracing, right? So hypothetically, what if we actually set over here, hypothetically, right? Let me use a red over here. What if for this part over here, right? So this is my question. Okay, what if I say rather than this dot NOF, I actually say this. Let me just make a little bit more space for myself over here. What if I say this dot facilities dot length? What if I say that, right? That's basically what the question I posed to you when I was developing the Eclipse. So the upper bound for I, rather than this .NOF, is going to be this particular expression over here. So what's going to be the consequence of that, right? It's a very important question for you. But now with the visualization we got already, it will be quite easy to answer. Let's say, for example, for the first 3 iterations, we will be okay because each index is really pointing to some non-null object for the facility. Okay, so now the answer would be, let me just put it here. So let me put the answer over here. Okay, let me put the answer. What's going to happen is when you actually go beyond the NOF, let's say for the 4th iteration, when I is equal to 3. When I is equal to 3, so that means you're going to try this particular slot and with this particular line in the body of the method, right? In the body of the loop. So that means you're going to get, let's say, here dot facilities at position 3 dot get payment due. That's basically what you're going to execute, right? Let's go exactly with this expression to see what's going to happen. Hyung dot, which refers to this particular object over here. Facilities is referring to the start of this array. Go to index 3. which is over here, is pointing to null. So what you're really having is null.getPaymentDue. So this will be null pointer exception, right? So let me highlight it very clearly over here. So this part over here is really referring to null. Okay, so this part here is really just null. It has not been occupied just yet. And when you call this particular method over here, it's going to give you null pointer exception. Okay, let me write it down. Null pointer exception. It's very important for you to realize that, right? So whenever, if you got a context object over here being null, and then you're trying to use dot, and then some attributes or some methods, it's going to have null pointer exception, because you simply just have no object over here for you to call the method and then find out what's the price and what's the unit. It's simply not possible. So that's why it's an exception. It's a logical error for sure. Alright guys, I think that's about very thorough tracing over here. I'm not going to do the debugger tracing. However, you can definitely try to set a breakpoint over here in the beginning of the getPaymentDue, and then you can simply try to step over to see for each iteration what's going to happen. Especially when you actually get to this particular one, you can step into the getPaymentDue and see what the context object is. It will be context object for getPaymentDue. The first iteration, it will be this facility object. The second iteration and the third iteration. And that's something we have done previously in the video for the tutorial. So I'm not going to take more of your time for doing this to repeat. Alright, so study this visualization here and study the code, and then we're going to move on to do more code developments for the member class.